I want to talk for a few minutes now about the world food situation. And I give these charts every year, and they look almost the same. And the only thing that really matters on them is where the line is on the right-hand side of the chart. And this shows that corn, there will be about a 6 or 7% carry out from one year to the next, meaning that when you get to when you start harvest in the fall, that if you looked at what the inventory is in the storage at that point, you have enough to take care of 7% of a year. So 7% times 52 weeks means you got about a 3.5 week supply left. That's pretty tight. You can see historically that's a tight number. And so corn prices are hovering around $6 a bushel right now, which is a pretty high number. For years and years when the U.S. subsidized corn, and incidentally they still subsidize it, but the price is so high that the subsidies never come into play. But when they subsidized it for years and years, that corn price was down around $2 a bushel, and now it's around $6. So we can see that it's in a much different place than it used to be. On the other hand, if you look at the whole world's corn inventory, and the United States is a big producer of corn, and corn becomes important both as an animal feed and as the raw stock for ethanol now, you'll see that at 15%, the world supply isn't nearly as tight. And that's honestly good news for most of the world, and I'm going to take you through just a couple more commodities to let you see that the situation on several of those is improving. If you look at wheat, you can see that we have a 40% carryover, which means there's a lot of wheat. And usually when food supplies get tight in the world, the crop that can recover the most quickly is wheat, because wheat takes about 10 to 15 inches of rain to get a crop. If you get 10 inches of rain, you might get a 40 bushel crop, and if you can get 15 or 20 inches, you might get a 100 bushel per acre crop. But during the growing season, and so this is a crop that you can come back quickly. Corn's not quite like that because it takes 30 to 40 inches of rain to grow a corn crop, and there's only a few places in the world that you can do that. And in the United States, that's mostly east of the Mississippi River, and hence Iowa and Illinois and Indiana are the big corn-producing states in the United States. But really, the supply of wheat in the world is fairly large right now. You'll see that was the U.S. number that we just looked at, and here you are with the world supply, and it's still above 30%, which means you've got a 15-week supply when harvest starts. And that has a tendency to stabilize prices at least for that commodity. For the first time that I remember in my adult life, the price of corn got higher per bushel than the price of wheat, which then means that people begin to use wheat as a feed for animals because it has as much nutrient value, maybe a little more than corn, but it also has some problems with it as a feed, so it can only be used to a certain extent. You'll see that soybeans are pretty tight, at least on the U.S. standpoint, but if you look at the world numbers, there's a much larger supply out there. One of the things that's been happening is China's been buying soybeans in large quantities, and they buy some from us, but they're big in buying from Argentina and Brazil. And you'll see that rice is also above 20%. So what that says is that food prices are stabilizing right now. And then what you'll see here is that the price of ethanol and the price of corn futures, and he's my PhD economist who does these slides for me so that I look smarter than I actually am, will show you that the price of ethanol and the price of corn really moved close together. There was a period back in the mid-2000s when they didn't, but that's when ethanol was being used as a substitute for MTBE as an oxygenator in gasoline. And when they got to where the supply was bigger than that and it began being used just as a fuel, then the price of the ethanol fell down quite a bit, and it now tracks very closely with corn. So there's something that's interesting that's happened with ethanol. First, the ethanol subsidy and the tariff were allowed to expire recently, and it went kind of quietly. And that was about 45 cents per gallon on ethanol that was being subsidized at the blender point. That was allowed to expire, and that subsidy was probably, if you looked at it in total, was $7 or $8 billion a year. And so that was allowed to expire. The tariffs were allowed to expire that would allow ethanol to flow in internationally. But the big producer of ethanol outside the United States is Brazil, and they're really not in any position to take care of this, take advantage of this right now because the world price of sugar is so high, and sugar is the stock that they've made ethanol from, and so they're making more by selling it as a food material. And so there's really not a lot of ethanol being imported into the United States right now, even though the tariffs are gone. What you'll actually see is that we're exporting ethanol right now, which really seems kind of unusual, and that hasn't been the history if you look at the chart in the long run, but right now the United States is actually exporting ethanol. And what you'll see is that the mandate is represented by the red line on this chart, and what we're actually producing is represented by the blue line, and we've been exporting some of that surplus that shows on the chart. Now, I think this is a really important chart, and this is the United Nations Food Price Index, and if you look at what happened in 2010, you'll see that line really was climbing fast, and in early 2011 it reached up to where that index number was 210. What happens when food prices get really high? What do you suppose happens? In the United States, I'll tell you what happens at my house when they get high. My wife comes home and she says, "Man, the price of such and such at the store sure is getting high." And I go, "Yes!" Because that means we'll do well this year. And I say, "We'll get enough bonus money to offset that increase, dear." But most people, when food prices go up, don't give the cheer, okay? And in the United States, if our food prices go up 20%, we get irritated. Now, consumptive income is apparently bigger than disposable income, because on disposable income in the United States, we spend about 10%, okay? And economists keep generating terms that I don't always understand, but I'll tell you this. The United States, we spend a small portion of our income for food. And if the price goes up 20%, and we now, instead of paying 6.5%, if we now pay 8%, we may be a little annoyed, but we get on with it. But if you're down lower on this chart and you're spending 40% of your income for food and it goes up 20%, you go in the streets and riot. And you destabilize governments. And when people go out to do that, we sometimes want to romanticize that and say it's the love of freedom that causes them to go out and want to overthrow repressive governments. But they're hungry. And high food prices destabilize governments. And if you look on the list down there at the bottom, those are fairly unstable countries right now. And so to have food prices come down by, on that index chart, by about 10% starts to help stabilize things again. But and the other thing I would note on this chart is that if you look at what people in China and people in India spend per year on food, they're spending less than $1 a day. And what that says is that as much as their economies have grown, most of the people in those countries still live in abject poverty. And so they can be destabilized also. You know, that as well as things appear to be going sometimes as we look from the outside, those people live in a very tight sort of circumstance as it comes to food. And we live in a really blessed land as far as those kinds of things go. So, you know, when you look at the top of the chart and you see a bunch of people in countries that spend $2,000 a person a year for food, and then you get down at the bottom and you see people spending $200 or $300 for food, you know that their diet isn't the same as those of us that are further up the chart. So, I don't have a summary slide, but I wrote down some notes. And and they're not as funny as the first ones. The world food situation, excuse me, has improved somewhat in the last year, and this does aid in stabilizing governments and countries. The ethanol subsidies have expired, but the mandate to use ethanol remains in place, which still props up the price. Now, my company has an advisory committee also, and we have a gentleman from Texas A&M University who's involved with transferring technologies to the marketplace. And he said at the current point, there is no alternative energy source that makes it without subsidies. So for all of the efforts that we're making in those areas, we still have to subsidize every form out there, basically. As the next farm bill comes up, with prices for ag goods being so high, you're very likely going to see most of the historical ag subsidies also expire. And, you know, for those of us that believe in the free market, I think that's a good thing. But it does signal an end to the government trying to keep the price of food cheap for people. It's a change in direction, and it will make the government's budget look better, but it might not necessarily make your budget look better on the whole. And for those of you who are out buying farmland, and I know most of you aren't, but the price of farmland in the United States and in the world is skyrocketing. I can tell you a little anecdote. We have some property in England, and we had several properties that are scattered around, and we were trying to sell some of those that were further out and buy some land that was in closer. And although these numbers may seem crazy, for land that would grow wheat and canola, we said if we can sell our land that's out in the distant for $8,000 an acre and buy land that's close to our headquarters for $9,500, we'll do that. And so we did a few land deals that way, and then we had one piece that was kind of up by itself, and we needed to sell a little bit more of this, and so we put it up for sale, and some Danish farmer came in and offered us $14,000 an acre for it. You know, we'd been sitting here playing at $8,000 or $9,000, and all of a sudden the market became $14,000. And I will tell you that recently, in the Midwest, where farmland has probably been in the historically $6,000 or $7,000 an acre range, that at an auction in Iowa, some land changed hands at $16,000 an acre for farmland. Now, current farm prices don't support that kind of price for land, but we're seeing institutional money that's making nothing in the stock and bond market right now moving to this because they see that they can just buy the land and lease it out for $300 an acre and make a 3% return and perhaps capture some land appreciation, and so they view that as the best available investment option. And they're not doing that uniformly throughout the country. They like that where it's a simple model where you just buy it and turn around and lease it to somebody and let them farm it. If you buy farmland in the Central Valley of California, you usually have to buy their permanent plantings, a lot of trees, and so you have to get in the business to capture that. You don't just rent that out. And so that land hasn't gone up like the land in the best parts of the Midwest. So there are some really interesting forces at hand. I think we're probably sitting on a bubble, but you know, it's only a bubble after it pops. So, but prices for farmland are high. Now, prices in this area are up. And there was land that I know a couple of years ago, there was land trading at $5,000 to $6,000 an acre, and I thought people were really stupid to pay that much for it. But you might have to pay $8,500 today to get it. And the value of water and a water right with a piece of ground in this area really affects the value of the property. So there's some really interesting forces at play nationally and internationally, but they're also in play here in the local area. So it'll be interesting to watch, but these are good times for agriculture. Farmers haven't stopped whining because they don't quite know how. And they don't want to get out of practice. But I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and hope you all have a great year too. Thanks.